People who never sat under an askance silence ask me what it sounded like, and I have to tell them that is the wrong question, because the whole point of it was that it sounded like nothing at all. They want roaring. They want the floor shaking and alarms and a voice on the deck speakers counting us down to the end. There was none of that. The end the escab brought you was the most ordinary thing in the world turned inside out. It was quiet. It was the kind of quiet you only ever get for a half-second in your whole life, between one heartbeat and the next, and they learned how to hold it open and keep you sitting inside it, until you broke yourself against the walls of it without anybody laying a hand on you. I was the youngest aboard the bulk tender Marin when it happened. 16, by the long-haul count we kept then, which meant I was old enough to swing a wrench and too young to know I should be more afraid than I was. I have outlived everyone who could correct my memory of it, which is the privilege and the curse of getting old. I am the last man who can tell you what the inside of that hold looked like with the star pouring through the ports, and what it felt like to have all the sound stripped out of the air, and what an old cook named Rourke did with a wooden toy that he carried in his apron pocket the same way another man might carry a knife. So I will tell it the way it happened, and you can decide for yourself whether to believe me. I have stopped minding either way. The Marin was not a warship. I want that understood before anything else, because in the years since, the story has been dressed up by people who were not there, and in their telling we were soldiers, and Rourke was some kind of grand tactician, and the top was a secret weapon that the Human War Academy still study. None of that is true. The Marin was a fat, slow, honest cargo hauler, 340 meters of welded ore tanks, and a crew module bolted to the front of them like an afterthought. We carried smelted metal between the rim foundries. We were 31 souls, most of us related to at least one other person aboard, because that was how the haulers crewed in those days, family on family, and we had nothing aboard that could be called a weapon except the cutting torches and a single old slug gun. The captain kept in a locker that nobody had the combination to anymore. We were not who the escab wanted. I have made my peace with the fact that we were simply who they found. A pack does not pick its meal out of love. It picks what is slow and far from help, and on that run the Marin was both. I have learned, since, more about the escab than I ever wanted to. Back then we knew them the way you know a shape in deep water, which is to say not at all, only enough to be wise to stay out of it. They were a pack species. That word gets thrown around for any alien that travels in numbers, but with the escab it was exact. They did not have ships so much as they had a single hunting machine that they rode inside, the way a hand rides inside a glove, and the thing moved and thought as one even though there were many of them in it. They did not announce themselves. They did not demand surrender. They did not, so far as anyone ever determined, take prisoners or trophies or cargo. They took the crew. That was the whole of it. They came for the warm, frightened things inside the metal, and the metal they left to drift. And the way they did it was the silence. I did not understand the mechanism then, and I only half understand it now, but I can tell you what it did, which is the part that matters. When the escab closed on a ship, they put out a field, and the field ate sound. Not muffled it. Ate it. Every vibration in the air, every rattle of a loose panel, every word out of your mouth, every scrape of your boot on the deck, all of it went into the field and did not come back out. You could shout until your throat tore, and the man next to you would see your face working, and your neck going red, and would hear nothing. You could fire that old slug gun and feel it kick against your shoulder, and the round would punch a hole in a bulkhead in total silence, like a thing happening behind thick glass a long way off. People hear that and they think, well, that is eerie, but it is not deadly. A quiet is just a quiet. You wait it out. You do not wait it out. That is the thing they understood about us that we did not understand about ourselves. A human being can stand almost anything except the absence of his own noise. We are loud animals. We hum without knowing we are humming. We clear our throats to remind ourselves we have throats. We tap, we shuffle, we breathe in a rhythm we can feel in our chests, and the whole loud machinery of being alive is wired so deep that we do not even register it until it is taken away. Take it away and a man's mind starts to come apart at the seams, because the silence tells him, in a voice he cannot argue with, that he is already dead and simply has not been informed. And here is the cruel hinge of it, the thing that made the SciFi what they were. The field was not perfect, it could not be. It ate the steady sounds, the constant low murmur of a living ship and a living crew, and that is what made the hush so total and so wrong. But it could not eat the sharp ones, the sudden ones, the spikes. A scream got through. A sob got through. A panicked fist hammering on a hatch got through. A body throwing itself against a wall got through. The field smoothed out everything you did on purpose and let through everything you did because you had lost control of yourself. So the silence was not the weapon. The silence was the bait. The silence was a pit they dug in the dark and lined with the worst parts of your own mind, and then they sat at the edge of it and waited for you to start making the only sounds that could still travel, the sounds of a creature coming apart. And every one of those sounds was a flare in the night to them. Every scream was a coordinate. They moved through a ship not by sight. We worked out later, but by sound, by the map of terror that the crew drew for them with their own throats, and they came to the loudest grief first and worked their way down to the quietest. And by the time they reached the quietest, there usually was no quietest left, because everyone had heard the others go and had stopped being able to be quiet. That was the doctrine. I did not have the word for it then. The records I read decades after called it, in the dry translated language of such things, the harvest of the voiced. To the SciFi, a frightened creature was not a victim. It was a participant. It rang itself like a bell to call them, and they came, and in their way of seeing it the creature had chosen, had cried out, had asked. They did not think of themselves as killers any more than a man thinks of himself as a killer when he follows the sound of a struggling fish to the net. They thought we were asking to be found. They had hunted 1,000 kinds of voiced thing across more dark than I can hold in my head, and every single one of them in the end had asked. They had never, in all of that, met a creature that answered the silence with a wooden top. The day it started was an ordinary one, which is how these things always begin in the telling, and I have found in the truth. We were 11 days out from the Vel foundry with a full load and a slow burn, and the watch had just turned over, and I was in the galley because that was where I was always sent when there was nothing else for the youngest hand to do. Rourke ran the galley. He had run it for longer than I had been alive. He was a wide, slow, soft-spoken man with forearms like mooring lines, and a face that had been weathered into a permanent mild squint, and he had 2 settings, which were silent and very nearly silent, and in the whole time I knew him I do not think he raised his voice once, not even at the end, not even when raising it would have been the most natural thing in the world. He had me peeling root that morning. I remember that. I have forgotten the names of men I served 20 years with, and I remember that I was peeling pale starchy root into a steel bowl, and that Rourke was at the long table with his back to me, doing something with his hands that I could not see, and that the star we were burning toward was coming through the galley port at a low slant, and laying a long hot stripe of white light across the table and the floor. And then the sound went out of the room. I want to be careful here, because everyone who tells this part gets it wrong, makes it dramatic, makes it a slamming door. It was not a slamming door. It was the opposite of a slamming door. It was as if a hand had reached into the world and turned a knob, and the knob controlled everything, the hum of the ventilators, the deep, slow thrum of the burn coming up through the deck, the small, wet sound of the knife in the root, the sound of my own breathing, the sound of Rourke's chair shifting under him, all of it, and the hand turned the knob all the way down to nothing and held it there. I dropped the knife. I know I dropped it because I felt it leave my hand and felt it land on my foot, and I felt the edge of it, and there was no clatter. A steel knife fell on a steel deck and made no sound. That is the moment, if you want to know, that the bottom dropped out of me. Not the silence itself, the knife. Because the knife told me the silence was not in my ears. The silence was in the world. I looked at Rourke. He had turned around. His face was doing the thing it always did, the mild squint, but his eyes were not mild, and that frightened me worse than the quiet, because in 3 years of knowing him I had never once seen Rourke afraid. He was not afraid now, I understood later. He was thinking. But to a 16-year-old the two looked the same from the outside, and I felt the scream start to climb up out of my chest. The animal scream. The one that did not ask my permission. And I knew, the way you know things in a falling dream, that if I let it out something terrible would hear it. Rourke crossed the galley. He did it slowly. I learned in the hours that followed that slowness was the whole of his method, though I did not know I was learning it. He crossed the galley at the pace of a man who has all the time in the world, and he put one of those mooring line hands flat on my chest, over the place where the scream was climbing, and he pressed, not hard, just steady just there, and he shook his head once slowly, and he mouthed a word at me. I could read it on his lips because there was nothing else in the universe to look at. The word was no. And then he reached into the front pocket of his apron, the deep grease-stained pocket where he kept his thumb rule and his bottle opener and the stub of a pencil, and he took out the top. I had seen it before. Of course I had. Every hand on the Marin had seen Rourke's top, the way you see a thing a man always has and never think about. It was a child's toy, or it had been. It was a spinning top turned out of some dark, close-grained wood, oiled black-brown by years of handling, no bigger than the top joint of my thumb, with a little brass spindle set into the point of it that had been worn to a soft shine. He spun it sometimes in the evenings, on the steel of the long table, an idle thing, the way another man might tap a coin or worry a worry stone. I had asked him once where it came from, and he had said, in his flat way, that he had turned it himself on a lathe a long time ago, and that had been the end of the conversation, because Rourke did not talk about the past, his or anyone's. He did not spin it now. Not yet. He held it up between two thick fingers so I could see it, and he looked at me, and the look said, plainly, watch this, and nothing else. And then he set it down on the steel table in the long white stripe of starlight, and he pinched the spindle, and he spun it. In the silence it made a sound. I cannot tell you the relief of that. There are no words I have ever found that carry it. In a universe that had gone utterly, killingly quiet, this small wooden thing went round and round on the steel and gave up a sound, a thin, dry, whirring clatter, the brass tip skating and catching on the metal, a tiny rhythmic chatter that rose and fell as the top wandered and steadied and wandered again. The field could not eat it. I understood much later why. The field ate the steady and let through the sharp, and the top was neither. It was a small, fast, irregular, mechanical noise with no fear in it, a sound that lived in the cracks of their weapon, and the Aska had built a hunting tool out of the assumption that the only sound a prey could make in the silence was the sound of its own terror, and they had never accounted for the possibility that a creature would simply choose, in the middle of the silence, to make a different kind of sound on purpose. The top wound down. The clatter slowed and tipped over into a last buzzing rattle and stopped, and the silence rushed back in. And I did not scream. I want to be precise about why, because it is the heart of everything. I did not scream because for those few seconds I had had something to do with my ears and my eyes that was not listening for my own death. The top had given me a thing to follow, a small bright spinning thing in the white light, and following it had used up the part of my mind that the silence was trying to break. When it stopped, the silence was just as total, but I was not the same creature it had been working on a minute before. I had been reminded by a toy that I could put a sound into the world if I chose to, that the silence was a thing happening to me but not a thing I had to become. Rourke pinched the spindle and spun it again. That was the first hour. Just the two of us in the galley and the top going round, and Rourke spinning it again every time it died, patient as a clock, while I sat with his hand on my chest and learned how to breathe in time with a piece of wood. I have to tell you about the rest of the ship, though I did not see most of it, because if I do not you will think the top saved everyone, and it did not. It saved the people who could see it or hear it. That was all it could do. The Marin was 340 meters of cargo, and the crew module was spread over 4 decks, and Rourke's top was one small voice in one room, and the silence had fallen over all of it at once. We lost the captain in the first hour. SciFi. He was a good man, and he died because he did the brave thing, which the silence turned into the fatal thing. When the field came down, he ran for the bridge to fight the ship, because that is what a captain does. And he could not raise the engines, and he could not raise a call for help because the field ate the signals the same way it ate the air. And somewhere in the corridors between his quarters and the bridge he met the thing that the silence had led aboard, and he did what any of us would have done. He shouted. He shouted a warning, I have to believe, shouted to the ship, shouted for his crew because that is the kind of man he was, and his shout was the loudest grief on the Marin in that moment, and it drew them straight to him. He drew them with the best part of himself. That is the cruelty I keep coming back to, all these years on. The silence killed the brave first. It killed the loud-hearted, the ones who could not sit still while their people were in danger, the ones who answered a crisis with their voices. It worked its way inward from the bravest to the most broken, and only at the dead still center of it, in a hot, bright galley, was there a thing it could not understand. We did not know SciFi was dead. We knew nothing. The field cut the ship into 31 separate solitudes, and each of us sat in our own silence believing we were the last one breathing, and that belief was itself a weapon, maybe the sharpest one they had, because a man who thinks he is the last of his crew has nothing left to be quiet for. Rourke broke that. I did not see how he decided it, but somewhere in the second hour he made a decision, and he stood up. And he took me by the collar, gently, the way he did everything, and he showed me the top, and he showed me his pocket, and he pointed at the galley hatch, and I understood that we were going to go and find the others, and that the top was coming with us. We went slowly. God, we went slowly. Every instinct I had screamed at me to run, to get it over with, to throw myself down the corridors and find another living face or die finding it, and Rourke would not allow it. When I started to hurry, he would put his hand on my chest again and shake his head, no, no. And I came to understand that the hurrying was the danger, that a body moving fast through the dark made the sharp sounds, the slamming, the stumbling, the gasping, and that a body moving slow and easy made the steady sounds that the field swallowed. Rourke moved through that ship like a man wading in still water, like the silence was a thing he could keep from rippling if he was careful enough, and he was right. We passed through 3 sections in the second hour, and nothing found us. And I have come to believe it was because the only sound we let into the world was the top. He spun it at every hatch. That became the rhythm of it. We would come to a sealed door, and Rourke would stop and crouch, and set the top spinning on the deck plate in whatever light there was, and we would wait while it ran down. And then he would open the hatch. And on the other side, more often than not, there would be one of our people, frozen, white-faced, the scream sitting in their throat like a stone, and they would see the top. And see Rourke's steady, mild face, and the stone would come loose without ever being spoken, and they would breathe, and they would join us. The top was a password into a person's broken mind. It said, without a word, you are not the last, you are not dead. There is a hand here that is still steady, follow the small sound. And they followed it. By the 4th hour, there were 9 of us moving together behind an old cook and a wooden toy. I will not pretend I understood, in the moment, what was happening to the escape. I learned that part long after from the records, and I will come to it. But I can tell you what it looked like from the inside of that crawling, silent line of 9, because there was one moment, in the long, bright cargo hold where we finally went to ground, when the hunt and the answer to it came close enough to touch, and I saw it. Or saw as much of it as a human eye can see of a thing that lives in sound. The hold was the biggest open space on the Marin, an ore bay 40 meters long that we had emptied at the foundry and not yet refilled. So it was a vast steel cathedral of a room, and it had the long ports down one side, the loading ports, 2-meter slabs of armored glass, and we had come into it just as the burn brought the star around to that side of the ship. So the hold was flooded. That is the only word. The white light came through those ports in great hard slanting bars and lay across the deck and through our shadows 40 feet long, and it was so bright after the corridors that it hurt, and it was utterly, perfectly silent, and the two things together made it feel like the inside of a held breath, like a moment that had been cut out of time and pinned to a board for examination. We were in a room full of light and empty of sound. I have never been anywhere like it before or since, and I hope I never am again. Rourke set us in the middle of the hold in the brightest of the light with our backs together, and he sat down in the center of us, cross-legged on the warm steel, like a man settling in for a long evening, and he took out the top, and he began to spin it, and this time he did not stop. That was the change. In the galley and the corridors he had spun it and let it die and spun it again, but now he settled into something different, something I can only call a watch in the old sea sense of the word, a turning of the hours. He spun the top, and when it ran down he caught it up and spun it again before the silence could fully close, so that there was always the small dry clatter going round in the middle of us, a heartbeat made of wood and brass, and around that heartbeat the 9 of us breathed, and the breathing fell into time with the spinning, and a thing happened to us that I have spent my whole life trying to describe and have never managed. We became calm. In the middle of a slaughter, in a room flooded with killing light and stripped of every sound but one, 9 terrified human beings became calm, because an old man was spinning a toy for us on the floor, and the toy said, over and over in the only language the silence allowed, "It is all right, it is all right, follow this, follow this. You do not have to be afraid, you have something to do with your fear, and it is to watch the top." And the Aska came and could not understand us, and that is the part I saw. I felt it before I saw it. You felt the Aska, when they were close, as a kind of pressure, a thickening of the air, though I think now it was not the air at all but some animal part of the brain ringing an alarm it had no words for. The pressure came into the hold from the far end, from the dark mouth of the corridor we had come through, and I felt the hair stand up all down my arms, and I looked, and at the edge of the light, just at the place where the bright bars of starlight gave way to the dark, something was standing. I will not describe it well. I have tried over the years and I always fail because the truth is I did not see it well. It did not want to be seen. It was tall and it was thin, and it was the wrong kind of still, the still of a thing that has decided not to move rather than the still of a thing at rest, and it stood at the edge of our light with the dark behind it, and it did not come in. That is the thing I have never forgotten. It did not come in. I understood, watching it, that it was listening. It had come to the loud grief, you see. It had followed the map. Somewhere on the Marin the last of the screaming had drawn it, and it had finished there, and then it had cast about for the next loudest thing, the next coordinate, and there was nothing. The brave were dead. The broken were dead. And in the great bright silence of the oar hold there was a sound it could not place, a small, steady, fearless, rhythmic chatter, going round and round, and the creature stood at the edge of the light and tried to read it and could not. Because it was not a sound of fear. Everything in the Aska's long art was built to find and follow fear, and the top made no fear at all. It made the opposite. It made the sound of a creature so unbroken that it had time to play. The creature at the edge of the light had hunted 1,000 kinds of voiced thing, and every one of them had asked in the end, had cried out, had drawn the line straight to itself with its own terror. And here were 9 warm, frightened animals who should have been screaming, who by every law the Aska knew should have rung themselves like bells, and instead there was this. This idle, patient, mechanical clatter that said nothing, asked nothing, begged nothing, and around it 9 creatures sitting calm in the light with their hearts slowing down instead of speeding up. It did not know what we were. I am as sure of that as I am of anything. It stood there and it could not solve us, and a hunting thing that cannot solve its prey is a thing in danger, because its whole world has just told it that the rules are wrong, and there is nothing in the universe more frightening to a predator than the discovery that the rules are wrong. The thing that had come to harvest our terror stood at the edge of our light, and I believe, for the first time in whatever long age it had hunted, felt the cold edge of its own. Rourke did not look up. He spun the top. The brass tip skated on the steel and caught and skated again, and the clatter went round, small and dry and utterly without fear, and the old man's hands were as steady as they had been peeling root that morning, and he did not look up at the thing in the dark even once, and I have thought about that more than any other thing in this whole story, because looking up would have been the sharp sound. Looking up would have been the flinch, the gasp, the spike that got through the field. By not looking, by spinning his toy and keeping his eyes on it as if it were the only thing in the world, Rourke made of his own body the same lie the top was telling. The lie that we were not afraid, that we had not even noticed it, that we were 9 creatures so far beyond its reach that we had not bothered to look up from our game. It is the bravest thing I have ever seen a man do, and it looked, from the outside, like nothing at all. It looked like an old cook playing with a toy on the floor. That is the thing the records never get and never will. The courage of it was invisible by design. The whole of it was to make the courage invisible, to swallow it down and let nothing show but the calm, because the calm was the weapon, and the fear, if it had shown, would have been the death of every one of us. The thing stood in the dark for a long time. I do not know how long. Time did not work in there. And then the pressure eased by a degree and then by another degree, and the place at the edge of the light where it had been standing was empty, and I had not seen it go, the way you never see them go, and Rourke spun the top and spun it again, and we kept our watch in the light, and it did not come back. It went looking, I have come to understand, for pray it could read. It left the room full of the unsolvable sound, and it went back into the rest of the ship to see whether there was anything left that still made sense to it, anything that still screamed, and there was not, because the screamers were already taken. And so the SciFi were left with a ship that contained only a small, dry, rhythmic clatter and 9 warm things they could not solve. And a hunting machine cannot feed on what it cannot solve. They broke off in the 9th hour. We did not know it was the 9th hour, or that they had broken off, or anything. We only knew that, all at once, the sound came back into the world. I have tried many times to describe the return of sound, and it is as far beyond me as the rest of it. The field lifted and the universe came back. The ventilators sighed. The deck thrummed. Somewhere a loose panel rattled. And the rattle was the most beautiful music I have ever heard or will ever hear. A stupid loose panel buzzing against its frame. And 9 human beings sat in a bright steel hold and listened to the ordinary noise of a living ship rush back and over them. And one by one, with no shame in it at all, we began to weep, and the weeping made noise, real noise, sobbing that filled the hold and bounced off the steel and was not eaten by anything, and we let it because there was nothing left to draw. Because they were gone. Rourke caught the top up out of the returning noise and held it in his fist, and he closed his eyes just for a moment, the only crack I ever saw in him. And then he opened them and put the top back in his apron pocket and got up, slow as ever, and started seeing to his people, because we were hungry and shocked and some of us were hurt, and that was a cook's work, and he went and did it. We lost 11 that day, 11 of 31. I have carried their names my whole life, and I will not list them here, because they were people and not a number, and the number is a thing the story wants, and they were not the stories to take. We buried what the SciFi had left of them in the long way of the haulers, out the cargo port into the burn, and we limped the Marin home on a slow course with the comms screaming for help the whole way once the field was gone, and a foundry cutter met us 4 days out and put men aboard who looked at us as if we had come back from the dead, which I suppose we had, and that was the end of it for us. It was not the end of the story, though, because of the records. The SciFi machine, the hunting glove they rode in, was not a thing that ever surrendered or was caught, not in those years, not by anyone. But years after the Marin, a long way from where it had found us, an SciFi pack made the one mistake a pack can make, which is to go after a thing that turned out to be bigger and faster than they had read it to be, and the hunting machine was crippled and boarded, and among the things taken out of it before it died were the pack's reckonings, their accounts. The harvest of the voiced, written down in the dry way they wrote things, a tally of every hunt and every voiced thing taken, and every variance noted for the teaching of the young. It took a long time to translate, and longer for any of it to come to me, because by then I was an old man myself, and the Marin was a story people half believed, and I had stopped telling it. But a researcher found me, a patient young woman who had read a name in the SciFi tally and traced it across 40 years to a retired hand living quiet on a rim station. And she brought me a copy of the part that concerned the Marin, and she sat with me while I read it, because she did not think I should read it alone, and she was right. Most of it was what you would expect, and I will not repeat it, because it is a list of how my friends died written by the things that did it, and there is no profit in it. But there was a passage at the end of the Marin entry, set apart, marked the way they marked things that the young of the pack were meant to study, an anomaly, a lesson, a warning. And the woman watched my face while I read it, and I read it 3 times, and then I started to laugh, and I could not stop, and she did not understand, and I could not explain, not at first, because I was an old man laughing and crying at the same time over a piece of paper, and that is not a thing that explains itself. What it said, in the dry translated language, was this. It said that aboard the metal thing designated by some number I have forgotten, the harvest had failed for the first recorded time in that pack's long line. It said that the voiced aboard had, against all art and all precedent, refused to ring. It said that the prey had been observed to produce, within the silence, a counter-acoustic emission, rhythmic, persistent, of unknown mechanism, which the pack had been unable to interpret or to silence, and around which the voiced had organized themselves into a state of unfear that rendered them unlocatable and unharvestable by every method known to the line. It said that the emission was believed to be a deliberate instrument of war, a device engineered by the humans for precisely this purpose, the defeat of the harvest, and that it represented the single gravest threat the pack had ever recorded to the doctrine on which their entire existence was built. It said that the young were to be taught to recognize it. It said that the metal things of the humans were, from that hunt forward, to be approached with the greatest caution, because the humans had built a weapon against the silence, and the weapon could not be parried, and the only defense the pack had found against it was to break off and flee. The single most dangerous thing the SciFi had encountered in a span of hunting longer than my whole species had been keeping time. The one weapon that broke their world. They had a place in their teachings for it, set apart and marked grave, a thing to frighten their young with, and the woman beside me had spent 2 years of her life tracing it across 40 years of dark, and the scholars who had translated it had written long, careful papers about the lost human anti-SciFi device, the counter-acoustic instrument, the weapon that no human archive seemed to contain. It was Rourke's top. It was a child's toy turned out of a scrap of dark wood on a lathe by an old cook who never told anyone where he had learned to do it. It had no mechanism. It had no engineering. It was a piece of wood with a brass tip on it that an old man spun on a table because it gave the youngest hand aboard something to look at instead of his own death. The deadliest weapon the SciFi ever met, the one thing in all their long murder that they fled from and warned their children against, was a toy worth less than a cup of coffee, and the only thing that made it a weapon was the hands that spun it, and the calm those hands could pour into a frightened room. That is why I laughed. The woman thought I had lost myself at first, and then I told her, and she did not believe me, and I did not blame her, and then I took the thing out of my pocket and set it on the table between us and spun it, because Rourke had given it to me, near the end of his life, with no ceremony at all, had just pressed it into my hand one day on the station where he had come to spend his last years near the only family he had left, which by then was me, and had said, in his flat way, "You keep it spinning," and that was all, and that was the whole of his will and testament, 4 words and a wooden top. I keep it spinning. I have kept it spinning for longer now than Rourke kept it, and I have taught the trick of it to children who think it is only a game, and maybe it is mostly. But I will tell you a thing I have come to believe, sitting with it in the quiet years. The SCA were not wrong. That is the part the scholars miss with their papers about the device that never existed. The SCA looked at that small dry clatter going round in the killing light, and they recognized it correctly as the most dangerous weapon they had ever faced, and they were right to flee from it, and they were right to teach their young to fear it. They only misnamed it. They thought it was a thing made of wood. It was not. The top was nothing. The weapon was the steadiness behind it, the human refusal to ring like a bell when everything in the universe was built to make us ring, the old animal stubbornness that answers an imposed silence not with a scream but with a small chosen sound made on purpose, for no reason but to give the frightened thing beside you something to follow. That was the weapon. The SCA had hunted 1,000 kinds of voiced thing, and every one of them had asked in the end. We were the first that did not ask. We played. So when people who never sat under an SCA silence ask me what it sounded like, I tell them the wrong question is the only one I can answer, and I take the top out of my pocket, and I set it on whatever steel is to hand, and I pinch the worn brass spindle that an old man's fingers wore smooth before mine ever touched it, and I spin it, and we sit and watch it go round in the light, and I tell them this. It sounded like that. Listen. It sounded exactly like that. And as long as you can hear it, you are not the last one breathing, and there is a steady hand somewhere in the dark, and you do not have to be afraid. You keep it spinning. That was the whole of it. You keep it spinning.